Hello and welcome to this edition of World at War. My name is Mohammed Saleh. The Israeli troops have stormed the Gaza City. This conflict could now witness a protracted period of street warfare at close range. Despite international pressure for a humanitarian ceasefire, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has told his generals to be prepared for a year-long war. Now, Tel Aviv's objective is pretty clear. It says that it wants to root out Hamas and ensure that the Gaza Strip never again poses a security threat to Israel. But Hamas, with its labyrinthine network of tunnels, has put up a dogged resistance so far. So what is Israel's strategy to trump Hamas's tactics of tunnel warfare? And how much longer can Hamas hold out against the ballistic Israeli onslaught? Our next report gets you the details.
Thousands of Israeli troops at this moment are operating inside the Gaza Strip. Details of what is happening in the northern part of Gaza are sketchy. But on the 9th of November, Israel released images of its operations inside Gaza City. Every building is scarred by war. Walls have been blown away. Bullet holes and shrapnel dot the facades. Palm trees have been shredded, and entire neighborhoods have been destroyed and flattened by bulldozers. In the past fortnight, Israeli troops have effectively cut the Gaza Strip into two. To understand the scale of the devastation, one must put the Israeli carnage in perspective. A total of 32,000 tons of explosives have been dropped on Gaza, in an area that is the size of Manhattan, which is just a portion of the city of New York. Half of all buildings in Gaza are severely damaged. Over 40,000 homes and business establishments have been entirely demolished. What really is Israel's long-term plan for the Gaza Strip is not clear. But Antony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, who has held hectic diplomatic parleys, is categorical that Israel must not occupy the Gaza Strip.
When it comes to post-conflict governance in Gaza, a few things are clear and necessary. One, Gaza cannot be continue to be run by Hamas. That simply invites a repetition of October 7th, and Gaza used as a place from which to launch terrorist attacks. It's also clear that Israel cannot occupy Gaza.
Hamas too has been releasing videos of its own. This video, accessed by Reuters, will give you a glimpse of how the Hamas fighters are setting up traps and are ambushing Israeli tanks. 39 Israeli troops have been killed so far in the fighting. An unknown number of Israeli tanks have been destroyed by Hamas by using simple handheld anti-tank weapons. Urban warfare is complicated. The Americans took over 6 weeks to capture Fallujah in Iraq in 2004. While the battle for Mosul against the ISIS in Iraq in 2016 went on for over 9 months. But the Israelis have been training for close-range urban warfare for decades. Right from the 1982 Lebanon War, in which the Israeli soldiers were in Beirut, to the second Intifada between 2000 and 2005. But the biggest challenge for Israeli troops in this war is a dense network of tunnels under the Gaza Strip. Israeli forces have so far found 91 tunnels and have destroyed them. But tunnel warfare is not easy due to the claustrophobic nature of narrow passages that are certain to be booby-trapped. Instead, Israeli forces are using sponge bombs and other novel weapons to cut off aeration inside tunnels, besides deploying overwhelming air power to bomb every inch of Gaza where Israel suspects Hamas could be present. This has meant enormous collateral damage. Over 11,000 Palestinians, including 4,500 Palestinian children, have been killed. Everything, including residential buildings, United Nations-run schools to hospitals, have been bombed. setting off human suffering that has sparked protests around the world. Gaza earlier was described as the world's biggest open-air prison. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has now described Gaza as a graveyard of babies. The 4-hour humanitarian pauses that Israel has now agreed to has sparked an exodus.
This is happening in an organized manner for the population living in Gaza, in a way that doesn't interfere with the fighting. It improves our situation. Because in the end, already more than 100,000 people have moved south just in the last 2 days. They move south, it allows us to battle Hamas. The second part is the humanitarian part that comes from Egypt by way of Egypt and the United States and other donor nations in the Arab world. They are providing food, medicine, tents, establishing field hospitals, and in the future there will be more hospitals established when the terror threat diminishes, and that's all happening south of Gaza, and that is why the population is moving. These two things together allow us to fight better, more effectively against the Hamas.
Netanyahu is opposed to a ceasefire as it would stop the momentum of the war. But a lot of leading voices, including Pope Francis and even the French President Emmanuel Macron, are now calling for a ceasefire. Even with Israel, voices of dissent are being openly sounded, such as those of the former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Netanyahu's image of being Israel's Mr. Security lies shattered. The Prime Minister's critics point out that he's prolonging this war only to stay in power. And it is the innocent young children who are paying the ultimate price in this war, where humanity has already lost.
The Russia-Ukraine war, which had dominated the headlines for the last 18 long months, has all but vanished from the public's imagination ever since the war in Gaza broke out. But the fact is, the war in Ukraine has not ended, even if American funds for Ukraine have now dried up. Even the most ardent backers of the Ukrainian counteroffensive have now tacitly admitted that Moscow has blunted Kyiv's western-backed offensive. And now, with the onset of winter, the fear is Russia, which is again mobilizing soldiers and is upping its weapons production capacity, could unleash a winter offensive for which Ukraine is both ill-equipped and underprepared. Our next report gets you more. The Russian fighter jets and missiles are still wreaking havoc on Ukraine. But you may not have heard about this because the attention of the global media at this moment is on the bigger and a more brutal war that has exploded in the Gaza Strip. What you may have also not heard about is that 96% of all US funding for Ukraine has now dried up. And the American President Joe Biden, who just weeks ago was boasting about America's ability to fight 2 global wars, is now finding it hard to keep the focus on Ukraine.
What I can tell you is that roughly of the total funds that have been provided to Ukraine since the beginning of the war, which is in excess of $60 billion, and that's not just security assistance, that's economic and financial assistance, humanitarian assistance. We've gone through about 96% of what's left, and greater than 90% of security assistance, replenishment funds, have been expended now.
So this is happening at a time when Moscow is now slowly beginning to tighten the screws on Kyiv. On the 9th of November, Dmitry Medvedev visited a weapons training range on the outskirts of Moscow and examined the latest round of ammunition that Russia has been stocking up to use in its winter offensive. Medvedev has also claimed that an estimated 410,000 contracts have been signed by Russians to fight against Ukraine, and their training is now nearing completion. On the 9th of November, Russia claims to have repulsed a major Ukrainian offensive on the left bank of the Dnipro River, where over 500 Ukrainian soldiers were trying to break through the Russian defenses, even as Moscow's military continues to bombard Ukraine's power infrastructure. Recently, Moscow even hit what Kyiv described as a civilian vessel in the port city of Odessa. On the front lines, Ukraine's artillery men are openly admitting that there's a sharp uptick in Russia's offensive. And this will only intensify further in the days to come.
We face a very strong and dangerous enemy. They have a lot of resources, more weapons, more liberators. The army is stronger than ours if we talk about quantity. But we fight them effectively. People that go around telling fairy tales, such as that their army can't fight, well, they are telling fairy tales.
The winter is about to set in. The West's attention is divided. American funds and weapons that were originally meant for Ukraine are now getting diverted to America's new war in the Middle East. And for the first time ever, Volodymyr Zelensky's Western allies are now privately nudging him to negotiate. The war that was precipitated as NATO tried to expand its frontiers in the east may quickly end with a negotiated stalemate, as Volodymyr Zelensky is finding himself more and more lonely than ever before on the international stage.
Of course, it's difficult when you have now the war on the Middle East, and nobody knows when it will finish, and nobody knows the result of this tragedy. But you have to know, if everybody been focused on Ukraine previous year, now you see the dividing focus. Yes, so a lot of challenges, and that's why there are some slow process.
The Myanmar junta is facing the biggest challenge to its authority since grabbing power in a 2021 coup. An alliance of Myanmar ethnic minority groups has waged a lightning offensive against the military in recent weeks. Hundreds of junta bases have been attacked in the north, northeast, northwest, and also the southeast of the country, resulting in the loss of 4 border trade towns with China. Such has been the onslaught that the military-installed president of Myanmar has now issued a dire warning, saying that Myanmar is in real danger of breaking apart if the military junta is not able to control the fighting soon. The United Nations estimates have put that nearly about 90,000 people have been displaced in Myanmar due to the intensifying conflict. Our next report gets you more.
In what could potentially be a turning point in the history of the Southeast Asian nation of Myanmar, the ruling military junta has suffered its biggest losses since grabbing power in a February 2021 coup. Former General Mie Sui, who was appointed president after the coup, held an emergency meeting of the ruling military council. The agenda of the emergency meeting was to address a series of coordinated attacks by the anti-military insurgents which have inflicted serious losses on the military. A coalition of 3 ethnic rebel groups known as the Brotherhood Alliance, the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, the Arakan Army, and the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, or the MNDAA, launched coordinated attacks on the military across a swathe of Myanmar's northern Shan state. Reportedly, they have overrun more than 100 military posts, captured border crossings, and the vital roads carrying most of the overland trade with China. Caught in the crossfire between junta forces and ethnic armed groups were Chinese personnel, who suffered casualties.
China is paying close attention to the conflict situation in northern Myanmar, expresses strong dissatisfaction with the escalation of the armed conflict and the casualties caused to Chinese personnel, and has lodged solemn protest with relevant parties. China once again demands that all parties involved in the conflict in northern Myanmar immediately cease fire and take realistic measures to prevent any incidents that endanger the lives and property of people in China's border areas from happening again. China will take necessary measures to safeguard the lives and property of its citizens.
Since seizing power in a military coup of February 2021, the military junta has battled an armed uprising against it. And in retaliation to the most serious setback that it had suffered recently, the military junta launched airstrikes and artillery bombardments, forcing thousands of people to leave their homes. But it has been unable to bring in reinforcements and recover the lost ground. Analysts, though, are of the opinion that the situation is still in favor of the military junta.
So in some ways, periodically, the military does lose out against variety ethnic armed groups, in Karen state, in Kachin state, or in Shan state. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the military is losing out on a national level. Right. So in some ways, as long as they maintain control of the Burma heartland, then its control of the country should be relatively secure.
Will the renewed attacks by the rebel forces lead to a wider campaign, resulting in the overthrow of the junta and restoration of the democratic rule? Well, it is still early days, but Operation 1027, so called because it was launched on 27th October, has made dramatic progress and given a new lease of life to the rebellion.
The Democratic Republic of Congo is Africa's second largest country. The Central African nation is rich in valuable mineral resources, but has been plagued by myriad armed groups in its east who are fighting for control. Preeminent amongst these is M23, a largely Tutsi rebel group linked with the neighboring nation Rwanda, though Kigali denies the charge. Since last month, there's been a surge in clashes between the Congolese army and the M23 rebels. The United Nations estimates have said that nearly about 200,000 people have been displaced from their homes following the escalation. On the 6th of November, the United Nations peacekeeping forces launched a joint security operation with the National Army designed to prevent the M23 rebels from capturing the key eastern cities. Our next report brings you more details.
Democratic Republic of Congo ranks among the 5 poorest nations in the world. Compounding the problem for the impoverished nation is the insurgency in its east, which it has been battling for decades. More than 120 rebel groups are fighting with national armed forces for power, land, and valuable mineral resources. Fighting spiked in late 2021 when the preeminent M23 rebels, largely dormant for nearly a decade, staged a comeback and captured large swaths of territory in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, displacing over 1 million people. After a period of relative calm, there has been a surge in clashes between the National Army and the M23 rebels since last month. To prevent the rebels from capturing Goma and the nearby town of Sake, a new joint military operation with the Congolese army and the UN peacekeepers was launched this past Monday. Interestingly, the operation, named Springbok, was launched after the Congolese government requested the accelerated departure of the unpopular UN peacekeeping forces known as MONUSCO.
As the force commander said, we cannot leave the people of Goma and all the Congolese people in particular in a situation of insecurity. We are going to provide security right up to the last minute before we leave. If the government tells us to leave, we will leave. But for the moment, we are shoulder to shoulder to ensure the security of the people of the Democratic Republic of Congo. We cannot abandon them.
Even though peacekeepers have been present in DR Congo since 1999, the country's east continues to be plagued by the militia violence. One of the world's largest and most expensive UN peacekeeping missions, MONUSCO has an annual budget of around $1 billion. Currently, it has a strength of 14,000, but is deeply unpopular owing to the perception that it is largely ineffective.
Goma has been under permanent threat for some time now, so now is not the time for MONUSCO to redeem itself or regain trust of the population. We are very disappointed to see the FARDC accept, or the government naively accept, this new offer from MONUSCO. MONUSCO has been here for over 20 years and has not been able to solve the security problems of the Congolese people.
Such has been the unpopularity that mobs have rioted outside the bases of UN peacekeeping forces in the past. As part of the new joint operation, several fresh defensive positions have been established. UN armored vehicles and heavily armed troops have been deployed in the hilly terrain near Sake. Will the newly minted joint operation prove effective in bringing lasting peace to the insurgency-plagued DR Congo's east? Well, time is surely running out fast, and so is the patience of Congolese.
"17 alleged leaders and associates of the Gambino crime family were arrested in a joint anti-mafia operation on the 7th of November. The transatlantic joint operation was conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in New York and the Italian police The arrests have come after 2 years of investigation targeting the New York's Gambino family and their Sicilian associates. The charges against them include racketeering, extortion, witness retaliation, conspiracy and fraud. If convicted, the defendants face maximum sentences of anywhere from 20 to 180 years in prison. Our next report gets you more details.
The Gambino family is historically one of the 5 prominent Italian-American mafia families in New York. The Gambinos were led by mobster John Gotti until his death in prison in 2002 and later by Frank Carli, who was assassinated outside his Staten Island home in March 2019. Previous charges against the family operatives include murder, loan sharking and illegal drug distribution. This past Tuesday, 7 people were arrested in small towns around Palermo and another 10 in New York following a joint Italo-American police raid against suspected mafia members. Among those arrested was a leader or captain in the Gambino family, Joseph Joe Brooklyn Lani, alleged Gambino soldier Angelo Fifi Gradilon, and Francesco Vicari, also known as Uncle Chico. The arrest followed a 2-year-long investigation, which revealed the solidity of the existing relationship between the Gambino family of New York and the Sicilian mafia. Additionally, the probe highlighted the American interest in the organizational affairs of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra. The Italian suspects have been charged with mafia association and other related crimes, whereas those arrested in the United States have been charged with criminal association, extortion, arson, conspiracy, and bid rigging. Intimidation and violent assaults were employed by the Gambino crime syndicate to embezzle funds, defraud unions, and employee benefit plans. The crime syndicate targeted demolition companies and the carting industry, also known as waste management or garbage collection. Members of the notorious family threatened businessmen and demanded mafia protection money or pizzo. Evading union rules, they rigged bids for lucrative demolition contracts. The arrested Gambino family operatives have also been charged with threatening witnesses, money laundering, and firearm offensives. No doubt these arrests have dealt a severe blow to the Gambino crime family and their nexus with the Sicilian mafia. A global response to a global phenomenon like the mafia is the need of the hour, and such joint operations will go a long way in battling the menace of criminal gangs.
And with that is the wrap on this edition of World at War. And if you want to reach out to me with any comments, feedback or suggestions, please feel free to do so on the ID that you're seeing on your screens. I'm your host, Mohammed Saleh, and I'll see you again next week.